course, life is not as easy if you're a farmer at the moment as it used to be, particularly with some of the inheritance taxes which are coming to many of them. But let's find out what's going on.
Do you have a message for the Prime Minister today?
Yeah, get stuffed.
What's brought you along to the protest?
We have about 400 or 500 sheep, 50 cattle, like it's a small family farm, and this whole idea that not many farmers are going to be affected is ridiculous. 75% of farmers are going to be affected by this.
They're going to ruin all the farmers' livelihoods in this country. They don't support farmers enough.
I think utterly ridiculous. I mean, there is no way that you're ever going to pay that off, not with farming.
We're constantly being undercut. We get not enough money for our food that we produce to actually make a living, and then now we've got a government that think they're going to tax us even more. We won't have any food produced in this country the way it's going.
The amount of people it will affect is so many more than they've said. Once you've weighed in tractors, the machinery and the rest of it, the asset value might be high, but the returns you get on that are 1%.
Britain is in turmoil. What began as murmurs of unrest in the countryside has exploded into one of the most aggressive crackdowns in recent history. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government has moved to detain farmers and even ordinary voters under sweeping charges of non-compliance, a label so vague it now seems to mean little more than disagreeing with official policy. Inside Buckingham Palace, the situation has struck a nerve at the very top. King Charles, normally a measured and restrained figure, has reportedly reacted with visible fury, convinced the nation is heading toward a point of no return.
Yeah, and how much harder has it been for farmers since obviously the announcement of that inheritance tax and no sign really, whenever I've spoken to farmers, of the government changing their position on it?
It's really difficult for various reasons, because farmers have planned their entire lives around inheritance tax, and then all of a sudden that's completely changed. So not only does that change the family dynamic, it kind of prohibits planning. They can't plan for the future.
In just a matter of weeks, the country has shifted from scattered demonstrations to a nationwide confrontation between the government and its own people. Farmers, long regarded as the backbone of rural Britain, are finding themselves in custody for resisting punishing tax hikes and restrictive regulations that threaten their livelihoods. Urban voters who dared to challenge MPs about the cost of living crisis or crumbling public services have been met with security escorts, expulsions from town halls, and in some cases, arrest. The escalation has been swift. Communities from Lincolnshire's fertile farmlands to Yorkshire's rugged hills have watched in disbelief as multi-generation family farms are reassessed at inflated values, pushing owners toward bankruptcy or forced sales. What began as peaceful tractor rallies and roadside protests has been met with riot shields, batons, and a state-level determination to stamp out dissent.
An extraordinary sight on the Paris highways. Tractors, hundreds of them, as far as the eye can see. Signs in French reading, "Angry Farmer," angry over what French farmers say is an existential threat to their way of life. Red tape, low prices, and high taxes they say may put them out of business.
The early stages of the movement carried the hallmarks of traditional rural dissent. Farmers arrived in convoy, their tractors lined along village roads, banners calling for fair treatment fluttering in the wind. Families gathered in open fields, united in frustration yet hopeful that dialogue could prevail. But as the weeks wore on, the tone shifted. The government's response abandoned any pretense of negotiation. Police units, equipped and coordinated like military detachments, descended on protest camps across the country. Makeshift barricades were dismantled in minutes, tents were torn down, and those who refused to disperse were forcibly restrained. On social media, disturbing footage spread rapidly. Elderly farmers struggling against arrest, young volunteers choking on tear gas, and communities watching as their neighbours were driven away in vans. It wasn't just the countryside that felt the weight of this new order. In towns and cities, residents attending public forums found themselves silenced for raising questions about energy bills, taxes, or the state of local services. Security staff removed attendees mid-discussion, while police waited outside to charge them with vague public order offences. What began as a campaign to enforce new regulations has morphed into something far more alarming. A message that dissent itself is now a punishable act. And with every heavy-handed arrest, public anger has grown sharper. spreading far beyond the farming heartlands into the nation's urban core. Within the palace walls, the unfolding crisis has pierced the usual detachment of the monarchy. Sources close to Buckingham Palace say King Charles has been receiving a steady stream of reports and unfiltered video footage from across the country. What he saw, according to those familiar with the briefings, left him visibly shaken. Unlike Churchill, the most offensive report from the protest site by police is said to have struck a deep nerve. For a monarch who has spent decades championing community resilience and rural heritage, the sight of state power turned against ordinary citizens was intolerable. Palace insiders describe a meeting where the king's frustration boiled over, his voice rising as he warned senior advisors that the nation was sliding into a state it may not recover from. This was not a symbolic expression of concern. The king reportedly took the extraordinary step of contacting Prime Minister Starmer directly, urging him to reconsider the crackdown before the damage became irreversible. While the details of that call remain private, it marked one of the rare moments in modern British history where the Crown's moral authority confronted the government head-on. That intervention, while discreet, has sent ripples through Westminster. It has emboldened critics and deepened the sense that Britain is in the grip of a crisis that can no longer be contained behind official talking points. If the government believed its crackdown would silence opposition, the result has been the opposite. Across the country, resentment has hardened into outright defiance. Farmers who once feared losing everything are now chaining themselves to their land. Urban voters, furious at arrests over public criticism, are turning protests into mass gatherings that spill into city streets. From Cornwall to Norfolk, stories are emerging that fuel the anger. A mother of 3 detained for questioning unexplained spikes in heating costs during a community meeting. A farmer's livestock seized overnight after a disputed tax bill. Young protesters told by police that speaking against government policy was non-compliant behaviour. These incidents have become rallying cries, shared across social media, inspiring others to resist. Starmer's administration, however, has doubled down. Ministers frame protesters as destabilising elements, insisting that strong measures are necessary to maintain order. But this narrative is failing to convince. Polling data now shows a steep drop in public approval, with once loyal supporters expressing disillusionment at the government's unwillingness to listen. The crisis has blurred political lines. Opposition parties, particularly Reform UK, are seizing the moment to position themselves as defenders of free speech and civil liberties. Even moderate voters who once dismissed such rhetoric are now openly questioning whether the government's methods align with the principles they believed Britain stood for. What began as a domestic crisis has now drawn sharp attention from abroad. Human rights organisations across Europe and North America have condemned the UK's sweeping arrests and the suppression of public dissent. Statements from Amnesty International and similar watchdog groups warn that Britain is breaching long-standing commitments to civil liberties. At the United Nations, the Human Rights Council has formally requested an explanation from the British government regarding the detention of peaceful protesters and the use of force in rural communities. Behind closed doors, diplomatic discussions are becoming tense. European partners already strained over trade disputes are quietly raising the prospect of economic consequences if the crackdown continues. International media coverage has been unflinching. Prominent outlets now speak of Britain as a nation in democratic decline, placing it alongside countries frequently criticised for eroding political freedoms. Images of riot police advancing on elderly farmers and young activists have circulated widely, damaging Britain's reputation as a champion of human rights. This mounting external pressure is more than symbolic. Trade negotiations risk being stalled, investment confidence is slipping, and Britain's standing in key alliances could suffer lasting harm. Yet, despite the growing chorus of condemnation, Starmer's government remains outwardly unmoved, presenting the unrest as a challenge to be crushed rather than a grievance to be addressed. The unrest is no longer confined to scattered rural protests. It has surged into the heart of Britain's largest cities, transforming frustration into a full-scale movement. London's streets have filled with demonstrators, waving banners and chanting demands for accountability. In Birmingham, crowds have blocked major intersections for hours, forcing public transport to a standstill. Manchester has seen nightly rallies where farmers stand shoulder to shoulder with students, nurses and shopkeepers, united in a rare display of solidarity. These protests have an energy that feels both urgent and unyielding. Tractors line city roads as symbols of rural defiance, while urban marchers carry placards calling for the restoration of civil rights. Bonfires blaze in countryside camps, casting light on gatherings where communities vow to resist until the government reverses course. Social media has amplified the movement's reach, turning isolated acts of defiance into a national spectacle. But this surge of public unity has come with a heavy price. Police presence at demonstrations is now a constant, with officers in riot gear patrolling perimeters and making arrests at the first sign of disruption. Footage from recent clashes shows water cannons and tear gas deployed against crowds, adding to the growing sense that the government is willing to escalate force rather than open dialogue. The divide is no longer simply political. It is cultural, personal, and deeply emotional. Britain's citizens are split between those who still believe in the government's authority and those who view it as an oppressor. That fracture is widening by the day, and the events on the street suggest reconciliation is slipping further from reach. King Charles's private warnings to the Prime Minister have now taken on a life of their own. Though the palace has offered no official statement, leaks from senior aides have made his stance clear, and the public has seized on it as a rare signal of dissent from the highest level. In a country where the Crown typically avoids direct political engagement, this moment has broken tradition, and the effect has been electric. Opposition leaders have wasted no time in framing the King's disapproval as proof that the government has gone too far. Reform UK has launched a nationwide campaign calling for an immediate suspension of the controversial regulations, citing the monarch's concerns as validation. Even some Labour backbenchers are beginning to distance themselves from the Prime Minister, wary of being seen as complicit in policies now branded as authoritarian by both domestic critics and international observers. In Westminster's corridors, tension is palpable. Ministers loyal to Starmer are working overtime to project unity, yet whispers of cabinet dissent are growing louder. Outside Parliament, protesters have started carrying placards bearing the King's image alongside slogans demanding freedom and justice, an unprecedented blending of royal symbolism with grassroots activism. The monarch's influence in this crisis is not rooted in legal power, but in moral authority. By breaking his silence, he has emboldened those who feared speaking out, adding a new and potent force to the growing wave of resistance sweeping across Britain. The government shows no signs of retreat. Starmer's administration is pressing ahead with its regulations, expanding enforcement powers and signalling that resistance will be met with even harsher measures. Police deployments are increasing in both rural and urban areas, and the definition of non-compliance continues to widen. What began as a dispute over taxes and policy has become a full-blown confrontation over the right to speak, to protest, and to live without fear of reprisal. In the countryside, farms are still being seized and families uprooted. In the cities, demonstrations are growing larger, louder, and more defiant. Each arrest fuels the next wave of unrest. The gap between those who govern and those who are governed has become a chasm, bridged only by suspicion and hostility. Communities that once shared common ground now find themselves at odds, wary of neighbours who might side with the state. International pressure is mounting, but the government appears willing to weather the storm rather than acknowledge fault. Economic risks are rising, diplomatic relationships are fraying, and Britain's reputation abroad is eroding with every day the crackdown continues. The King's intervention has brought moral weight to the opposition, but the path forward remains perilously unclear. The country is balanced on a knife's edge. One step toward reconciliation could defuse the crisis. Yet one more act of aggression could plunge Britain into a political breakdown from which it may never fully recover. For millions, the choice now is stark. Remain silent and endure, or stand up and risk everything in the hope of reclaiming the freedoms they believe are slipping away. Britain stands at a historic crossroads. The mass arrests, surging protests, and King Charles's rare intervention have transformed a policy dispute into a national reckoning over democracy itself. This is no longer about tax laws or regulations, It is about whether the freedoms people took for granted can survive under a government determined to silence dissent. The divide between the public and those in power has never been sharper, and each day of inaction deepens the fracture. The next moves from Downing Street, the Palace and the streets will decide the country's fate. Pull back now, and there's a chance for reconciliation. Push further, and Britain risks sliding into a future defined by repression and unrest. The world is watching, and the outcome will shape not only the nation's identity, but the legacy it leaves for generations to come.